All right, we're going to do a review now for the test on chamber music, exam number 3. And so I think I'll start just with a general review of the works that we covered. Although I haven't had any questions yet on dates, I can still ask you a question about that. Those are important. So what we had with the Corelli are 2 trio sonatas. The dates of Corelli's life are 1653 to 1713. And for date of composition, these two are right around 1690. So these are the earliest works that we're studying in the semester. One thing I'll just remind you is that you do not have to identify specific movements of the Corelli works. You just need to be able to identify Opus 3, number 7, as an example of the Sonata da Chiesa, and Opus 4, number 5, is an example of the Sonata da Camera, the collection of dances. So the second work that we did was the Bach Flute Sonata in E-flat major. And I mentioned that this work, there's a little controversy as to whether or not J.S. Bach composed it or whether his son, Carl Philipp Emanuel, might have been the composer. But at any rate, it has traditionally been attributed to J.S. Bach. It has a BWV listing, so BWV 1031. And the dates you should put are just for J.S. Bach's dates, 1685 to 1750. An approximate date of composition, like 1725. So that particular work does have 3 movements. You need to be able to identify each of the 3 movements. The first movement was an example of ritornello form, so it had a lot of concertato elements about it, a lot of concerto elements. The second movement was the movement that was entitled Siciliano, and that is a type of Sicilian dance that is in compound meter, moderate tempo, usually has dotted rhythms in the melody. And then the last movement was written in rounded binary form. So that was the second work we did. The third work, we did the second movement of the Haydn String Quartet, Opus 76, number 3. That is nicknamed the Emperor. So the dates of Haydn's life are 1732 to 1809. And this work is a later work. It's 1797. And so we did that second movement, which is in theme and variation form. So it was the theme that Haydn had written as a birthday present to Emperor Franz, and it was known as God Save the Emperor Franz. So it's a very famous melody which is used for hymns and so forth. So you should know a little bit about that. And then we did 2 movements of Beethoven string quartets. The first was Opus 18, number 1, so that is the very first Beethoven string quartet. And so that work is in sonata allegro form. The dates of Beethoven's life are 1770 to 1827. So 1770 to 1827, and these were published in 1799, so the very end of the 18th century. The other that we did was Opus 59, number 1, which is one of the 3 quartets. The Opus 59 quartets were published there in the middle of the first decade of the 19th century, so around 1805, 1807, and these were dedicated to Razumovsky, who was a Russian diplomat, and so you should know a little bit about Razumovsky, someone who was a very fine violinist, and he actually is the person who commissioned these works of Beethoven. And Beethoven does include Russian themes, although this first movement didn't have a Russian theme, but later movements do. So a great example of sonata form. And then we had two trio sonatas. The first was by César Franck, and it is the sonata for violin and piano. Franck's dates are 1822 to 1890, and this also is a later work. So 1885 is the date of this great violin sonata. So this is a 4-movement work, and you'll have the first and the fourth movements to identify. First movement is in sonatina form, and the last movement is a compound ternary form, and is the one that starts out in an accompanied canon with the right hand of the piano being the leader and the violin following one measure later, duplicating that melody that you heard the measure before in the right hand of the piano. And so that is what's going on in the first A section, and they switch parts, several times. And so you want to know, that basic term, accompanied canon. This is a work that was cyclic, and so you want to be able to talk about that as an organizational feature. That opening A theme from the first movement returns in each of the 4 movements. So that's the Franck, and then the last work is the Brahms Sonata for clarinet and piano in E flat major, opus 120, number 2. You have the first and second movements of this to cover. And so the first movement is in sonata allegro form. I made the point that there are a lot of similar features in the way that the form is approached, similar to opus 59, number 1, the Beethoven String Quartet, the Razumovsky Quartet movement that we looked at. So neither of those used double bars around the exposition, and they have extensive motivic thematic development techniques in them. And so second movement of the Brahms is a scherzo trio movement, and so that was a pretty straightforward scherzo movement. So first and second movements of the Brahms. So if you look at the review questions for exam 3, I'll go through just some of the high points of this. So this section on chamber music is a discussion of ensemble music that is for a small number of players. Usually each player has his own part. And so the genre is one which really blossoms at the beginning of the Baroque era, so in the 17th century. And that century is one that really sees the rise of instrumental music in general. So we see the development of the sonata, which is a work for instruments. That is something which is associated with various combinations. So I mentioned the fact that by 1660 there were 2 types of trio sonatas that had developed. The sonata da camera, which was a collection of dances. So you should know the standard dance movements that evolved by the time that J.S. Bach was writing collections of dances. So the term suite is the term that was used to describe that collection of dances. So go back and look in your notes for a description of allemande, courant, sarabande, and gigue. Those are the 4 standard movements. And then Bach would add other movements in there. But these trio sonatas of Corelli that we looked at were written at the end of the 17th century, and so you didn't have that standardization yet, but you do start to see movements like allemande and courant being used. And one of the things that Corelli is associated with is the development of binary form. And so you have a lot of the dance movements being written in binary form, and that is the form you should associate with dance movements. So you should be able to talk a little bit about those Baroque dance types. And then the other type of trio sonata besides the sonata da camera is the sonata da chiesa, and this is typically a 4-movement work, and it had contrasting tempos. So opening slow movement, then a fast movement, a third movement that's a slow movement, and then a concluding fast movement. So slow fast for the sonata da chiesa. And so with Corelli, there are innovative elements with his music. So in addition to developing binary form, he also is someone who is writing completely in the major-minor system of the common practice era, so the beginning of the Baroque. So of course he's using figure-based notation that indicates real clearly chord progressions. And he is establishing works that are based on an overall tonal plan. The most basic is tonic, dominant, and then back to tonic. And so that's an important element in form. And so he had some other characteristics that, for one thing, he was an Italian who didn't write any vocal music, and so he only wrote string music, so that is a little bit unusual. And I talked about the use of chain suspensions, so that use of consecutive suspensions, and also the use of Phrygian cadences. And I mentioned the specific type of half cadence, that 4/6 to 5, which is used at a lot of cadential inflection points in his music. So he pointed out several of those in that Sonata da Chiesa. Corelli also uses lots of sequences, which is a basic articulating device, a way of generating material and developing material. It gives a sense of coherence and logic. So the trio sonata is the most important type of chamber music in the Baroque period. We'll see that the string quartet becomes more important in the classical period. But with the trio sonata in the Baroque period, that is a work that has 3 parts. It has 2 solo parts, and then it has a continuo part. So you need to know what the term continuo refers to. And so you should mention, it has an obbligato left-hand bass line that would be played by a keyboard player. And then underneath that would be the numbers that indicated the intervals above that bass line. And so that would be improvised. So that right-hand part of the keyboard was not obbligato. In other words, it was not specifically notated, but the keyboard player would improvise upon that chord progression. And then there would be a second instrument, usually a cello, that would double the left-hand part of the keyboard that would then yield a total of 4 players. So trio sonata, 3 parts, but then 4 players to perform it. So then, just looking back here at the review sheet, the term duo sonata has to do with a single instrument plus keyboard, and so you start to see some of these with Corelli. So that begins in the Baroque era. The Bach flute and cembalo sonata is an example of a duo sonata, as are the Franck violin sonata and the Brahms clarinet sonata. So all of those are examples of duo sonatas, very important genre within the overall area of chamber music. So I already mentioned the terms Siciliano and Obbligato. The term Empfindsamer I talked about that in this transitional era between the end of the Baroque and beginning of the Classical. So it's a pre-classical style. Empfindsamer means sensitive, so it's a sensitive style, and associated with Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. So goes by the initials CPE, Bach. North German style, especially emphasizes the element of contrast, as well as a second characteristic of motivic thematic development. And so that's an important style that emerges in the 1740s or so. A little bit earlier we had the galant style that is associated with various countries in Europe, Italy, France, England, and that style was one that was lighter and a style that's intended to delight and please the listener. So it featured closed phrasing and homophonic textures. So it's those two styles that come together in the 1760s and then beyond in the works of Haydn and Mozart, who are the two composers who really establish the full glory of the Viennese classical style that then forms the background of the works of Beethoven, who takes us into 19th century Romanticism. So be able to describe Empfindsamer and the galant style. Then the term fugato, that has to do with a fugue-like passage within a typically a homophonic work such as Sonata Allegro. So very often you could see these passages in development sections. So that's was the context for that term. We saw that in the development of Opus 59, number 1, Beethoven String Quartet. And so that was at the end of the development section that you hear that fugato passage where the texture reduces to just 2 voices and you hear these 2 themes. Actually, it's like a little double fugue, and that then one by one, each of the players of the quartet present the thematic ideas, and they layer on top of each other just like a fugue, hence that term fugato. The term canon, I mentioned that already with the Franck violin sonata, that last movement of that. The term stretto is another contrapuntal type term, which you might have studied that in theory in looking at terms associated with the fugue. But a stretto is a passage that features overlapping entrances, usually of a shorter motive. So it's very similar to a canon, but it's not as long of a passage. It's a shorter kind of passage. So it usually has to do with the fugue subject itself and having overlapped, piling up of the subjects, one voice upon the next. So it's layered like you have in a fugue, but